Thank you all for coming here for the inaugural lecture for Center for Heritage Conservation at CEPT Research and Development Foundation. Before I introduce the center, and that will be followed by Gill's lecture on conservation and heritage, partnerships and sustainability, I would like to first invite Bimalbhai and Surenbhai to say a couple of words and put the center in the context of what CRDF is trying to do at CEPT. Bimalbhai, please welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for putting me up there first. Okay. First of all, I think congratulations are in order. I think it's a lot of work that Chigna has put in to bring all of us are very pleased that you are reactivating and starting off this center. So this is very good. Congratulations are also in order to, also due to Suren. He has been working hard to try and bring some sort of system and order into the functioning of CRDF. And this, I believe, is the first new center that you are establishing at the CRDF. And so congratulations, this is good stuff. I'm eager to find out what's Chigna's and Suren's conception of this new center is. She asked me to say a couple of things about how we view these centers at CEPT, and I'll do that. I'll try and flesh out. CEPT as a university does a number of things. The first thing it does is teaching, and that's what we do through our normal teaching programs. And they're all located inside the university. And the university, lots of people in the university, both full-time people as well as adjunct people as well as visiting people, are all focused on trying to deliver the best quality of teaching and to ensure the best quality of learning in the university. The university is also engaged in research work. Some of this research is done by individuals in the universities in their individual capacities, but some other research requires, this is done on contract with money coming in for research projects. All of that work is now organized in centers which are focused on particular areas of inquiry. And that all these centers are located in the CEPT Research Development Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organization 100% owned by the university. So that's the research end of work. Part of it gets done in the university, part of it gets done through these domain-focused centers. And some of the people are the same people, only wearing different hats or using different platforms. One might ask a question, why do you have these different arrangements? It's simply to keep more clarity in the accounting, more clarity in the roles and responsibilities. And we had some legal issues with getting money into the university for activities other than teaching, income tax related things, and we had to create this separate organization. So that's why we are doing it in CRDF. The third really is the university, as CEPT, has always been engaged in working along with government on policy issues, both analysis of policy, which is more like research, but also helping government formulate policy. This sort of policy work is also to be done in CRDF and in the centers. A few years ago, we had a big sort of a churning and a clarification of what sort of work the CEPT as a university will get engaged in. Yes, it'll certainly do teaching, certainly do research, certainly do policy, certainly help government manage programs, but it will not do run-of-the-mill standard consulting work. This, it was felt, was best left to organizations outside the university that will be able to do it more justice and do it much better, more efficiently than we'd be able to. So the centers, per se, are not consulting firms. They are, well, they are to be consulted by government or by anybody else. So far as the role involves sitting on the side of government or whoever it is, not across the table as a contractor. So that's really the key difference that we are trying to slowly institute in the functioning of the centers. So that said, you wanted me to clarify what the role of a center is. And that's, I think, as clear or nebulous as it is just now. Slowly in practice, these things will get resolved. And with that, once again, thank you very much for all your efforts. I'm hoping that soon your center will be flourishing, doing all sorts of work, and there will be large number of people involved in it, lots of activity that you are doing. So wish you well, and whatever support you need, you have. Thank you very much.
I'll invite Mr. Suren Vakil. He is the Vice President of CEPT Research Development Foundation, to say a few words.
Congratulations, Jigna, on moving forward with this initiative of setting up a new center. We put out a call a few months ago for new centers, and we've actually set up 2 new centers, and I'll talk about that. But basically, as Dr. Bimal rightly pointed out, that we needed an organized approach within the university for our research and advisory activities, and essentially CEPT Research and Development Foundation aims to do that. But I'd like to think that we're more than that. I think universities in our country need to work more with local government, with industries, and having a framework, having a platform which is aimed towards these sorts of activities would certainly help. And CRDF is essentially, it shares the unique culture of CEPT University. Most of the work at CRDF is carried out by CEPT University staff and postgraduate students. And I like to think we add to the knowledge and experience of CEPT University. So broadly speaking, what do we do at CRDF? We carry out 3 functions. One is we carry out research in particular domains within the centers. Second is we carry out advisory work. Again, as Bimal said, we sit alongside policymakers, government, advise them on ways forward. And we also, the third thing is we help build capacity through workshops, conferences, courses within each of the domains that we work in. So we work through a number of centers, and currently we're at 8 centers. We have put out a notice some months ago to attract more centers, and I'll just tell you a little bit about each center, not too much. So we work in urban transportation, which works with local government on public transportation policy and projects, water and sanitation, and improving urban water and sanitation in the country. They've been working on some exciting projects, and they've been strongly supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Building science and energy, which carries out research on how energy is utilized in buildings and how we can reduce energy usage. There is a center which is dedicated to crafts and helping local artisans to flourish. Applied Geomatics is the second new center which we've just set up, and that focuses on using geospatial technology in the urban context to help planners, engineers, public officials. Urban planning and policy, guiding urban planning policy, carrying out landmark projects, working on urban development and planning. So we have a center which does that, which is essentially the soul of what CEPT does in many ways. We have a state-level anchor institute within as a center for infrastructure, and obviously our newest center, heritage conservation, and I'll let Chigna talk about that. So please, Chigna, thank you.
Okay. Most Indian cities have historic cores characterized by dense neighborhoods, networks of streets, markets. In them are communities living with their own social practices and economic challenges and opportunities. As many of us are aware, these areas are riddled with infrastructural issues, vehicular congestion, pollution, high noise levels, poor health and hygiene. We are also acutely aware that the processes of conservation or development have not necessarily always been successful. And when successful, as ground gestures, they pose their own challenges to heritage. Most are not able to address the contingencies of these complex realities, and the concerns for heritage is, in this context, not removed from the questions of development. The Center for Heritage Conservation, with its broad but situated understanding of history, heritage, and conservation, has been established with a vision of becoming a platform for research, advisory, and capacity building of the practice and policy of heritage conservation in such complex environment. With a firm belief in ethics of conservation and sustainability, the center intends to engage with government and non-government bodies to inform practices on ground and to create solutions that are long-term and equitable. We are not starting in a vacuum. We already have a master's program in conservation and regeneration at Faculty of Architecture that becomes a laboratory for explorations and capacity building. The program already functions with international collaborations, York being one of them, and we had a fantastic 3-day training workshop on digital documentation and 1-day seminar on town walls of both the cities. We are ably supported by the material laboratory that supports studies and understanding of research on material fabric. Khushi Shah is just now in charge of that laboratory. She's here with us today. Through that laboratory, we have already undertaken some capacity building workshops for practitioners who have done some studies on material exploration. We had the workshop that we had done focused on lime mortar and clay mortars that are used in the Indian condition. The center is already in process of developing active partnerships with government departments. We already have a working MOU with Department of Archaeology and Museums, Government of Gujarat. We do a lot of interactive sessions with them, and we are hoping to carry this collaboration forward. Our first project, I very proudly say, is to advise Agra Municipal Corporation, and the team of that is working on that project. I believe all of them are here. Sashwat, Koshi sir, they're all here. I believe Rutul was also on her way here. Maybe she got lost somewhere. Okay. So, the center here is directly responding to the requirement of conserving and preserving the heritage of the city as directed by the Supreme Court to the municipal corporation. The center will also strive towards creating a platform for public outreach and stakeholder engagement with the intention of bringing relevant discourses in the foreground. Today, in that context, we start with a lecture by Dr. Gill Chitty, titled Conservation and Heritage, Partnership and Sustainability. Dr. Chitty is Director of Center for Conservation Studies at Department of Archaeology at University of York. She also heads the MA program in conservation there. Dr. Chitty has over 30 years of professional experience in heritage sector, working in conservation and public archaeology, including as a head of conservation at the Council for British Archaeology, advisor at Lancashire County Council, and English Heritage Monuments Protection Program. It is my pleasure, and with a lot of gratitude, I welcome Dr. Gill Chitty for the inaugural lecture of Center for Heritage Conservation at CEPT. Welcome, Jill.
I'm sorry for this intrusion and this disruption, but I had meant to say it, and I sort of, in the rush that I was doing it, I sort of forgot. I think while we celebrate the starting of this new center, I said in between, at some point it's a restarting of a center, because the work of heritage conservation and the work along with government of doing work on heritage issues has a long tradition in CEPT. And I should have mentioned that, my apologies. When we celebrate the starting of this new center, we are also in a sense celebrating all this long history of work that has been done. I don't have, someday you must do a sort of an account of what all has been done. But I remember in the early years, even when I was a student, it started off with some work on Fatehpur Sikri and various other places at a time in the 70s and 80s when these topics were hardly talked about. We had Professor Jain, Professor Vasavda, Mickey is here, talking about old structures, their value to present times, and in a variety of ways, keeping alive the topic of conservation, of the value of old structures in a sense of heritage protection, etc. And after that, I think one major big achievement was Ahmedabad proudly calls itself the heritage city, the first heritage city of Ahmedabad, and all that work was done by Professor Vasavda when he was here, of listing, and Kushi, I believe you were also involved in this. I'm sorry that I'm not personally conversant with all the work that was done, but I know clearly that there was a huge amount of work that was done. And then for a while we had a lull, and we are starting off this new center in a new format and with a new set of objectives, agendas. It all sits atop all of these efforts that were there. So while we celebrate the starting of the new, I'd also like to thank everybody. Professor Vasavda is here, Mickey is here. I'm sure I'm missing out on, Kushi is here. There are a bunch of people who worked. Jigna herself was part of some of the earlier efforts. We must also acknowledge what we sit atop, in a sense, that all of this that has fed. That would be just fitting when we are talking about heritage. It would be not right not to talk about it. So sorry for the intrusion. I just wanted to mention that. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd just like to say how grateful I am to be invited. I feel it's an absolute privilege for us to be here, for me to be here with my colleagues. York has had a very long association with CEPT since Professor Vasavda came to visit York when he set up the first Centre for Conservation Studies in 2007, I think, with the initial memorandum of understanding that the University of York had with CEPT was set up then. And we renewed that at the ICMOS Congress in Delhi in 2017, in fact, yeah. So we've set up there a sort of 5-year agreement for how we would work together in capacity building and research. So a huge honour for me to be here to talk to you. And as some of you know, there's a small group of us here from York, from the Centre for Conservation Studies, and we've been working with colleagues at CEPT and from AMC, running workshops and developing ideas for how we might collaborate in the future in research and in conservation practice. And I'm here with my colleagues from the City of York, John Oxley, the city's archaeologist, Dr. Keith Emmerich, the Inspector of Ancient Monuments for our region from Historic England, and my colleagues Louise Cook and Alessandra Sprague. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the activities of the Centre for Conservation Studies at York and how our research and our teaching interacts with conservation processes in the city and at a national level in the UK. There are just enormous opportunities here in Ahmedabad. It's very exciting, and there's so much I could say, but I'm going to sort of hold myself back. And first of all, I'd just like to introduce you to York, those of you who weren't here earlier in the day for that wonderful talks that we had from John and Keith. The historic city as it is today, for those of you who already heard me speak this afternoon, please be forgiving of the fact that you're going to see some of the same slides again, but not many. So I want to introduce York to you, a bit of a timeline there. Then I want to introduce the Centre for Conservation Studies at York. It's a little bit about its history. We're 47 years old this year. How we came to be in York, how it's developed, and to talk about conservation history as it's kind of threaded through the story of York's historic walled city. And then I want to speak to how our research and our teaching today are contextualised in our city and its heritage and its conservation. So, the City of York is a small urban centre and a large international heritage visitor attraction. It gets about 7 million visitors, tourists a year. Our population in the city and its environs is 200,000, so we are very much outnumbered by our tourists, and tourism does dominate our economy. In relation to Ahmedabad, we're at these two plans are of the walled circuits of the two cities, the World Heritage Site on the far side, and York's walled city on this side. So York is 2/5 the size of Ahmedabad in terms of the walled circuit, a mere 3 kilometres instead of 10 kilometres around its perimeter. So necessarily the scale at which we plan and manage our resources are rather different from Ahmedabad, but I think the issues and the concerns, the common concerns that we face are very similar, as we've just been discovering in the last week as we've worked together. So this is where we're based in York, in the King's Manor, in the centre of York. So York Minster, which some of you may have visited, our city walls coming down here, and King's Manor just outside the city walls in the precinct of the Abbey of what was the Abbey of St Mary, which was dissolved in the 1530s. So our city wall comes through here, and the precinct wall of St Mary's Abbey comes round here. So here we are at King's Manor, the former Abbott's lodgings for the Priory of, the Abbey of St Mary, which was converted to the King's Manor, the headquarters for the royal presence in the north of England after the dissolution in the 16th century. So we're just a few minutes from York Minster, and we're right in the centre of the city. And for those of you who like kind of university statistics, there's a few on the far side. We have about 60 staff, just under 300 undergraduates, about 150 now postgrads, about 50 research students, and our research income target is just under £3 million a year. So Conservation Studies at York were founded in 1972 through the vision of a dynamic young architect called Patrick Nutchens. It came to the King's Manor in the 1960s to be based in what was then a state-of-the-art teaching facility in a new building that was constructed at the back of the inner quadrangle over the top of the 17th century vaulted undercroft that is still there, which we use as our computer lab. So the centre came to King's Manor to be in this 1964 building, which was designed by Sir Bernard Fielden, who some of you here may have met, I'm sure, renowned conservation architect who also taught here in the early years. And this 60s building is now a Grade 2-star listed building in its own right. The Institute of Conservation Studies was the first course of its kind to offer a Master's Award. It predates the university itself. And it attracted students from around the world under the leadership, and again, these people that some of you may have met in the 90s and 80s, Douglas Wise, Derek Lindstrom, then Peter Barman from 1990, Jane Grenville, and prior to myself, Naveen Piplani, who's now director of Intact's Heritage Academy. Alumni of our programme now work around the globe and in many eminent positions, both academics and leaders in international policy. Derek Lindstrom and Bernard Fielden, I know, made a number of visits to India in the 1990s for seminars and workshops, a bit like the ones we've done today, actually, but around the focus on urban conservation. And I know several people here had the opportunity to work with them both at that time in the 1990s. Internationally respected figures such as our eminent professor Jukka Jokeletto, advisor to UNESCO, began their conservation careers in York, and indeed the late James Semple Kerr, whose work with the ICOMOS Australia and the Australian National Trust introduced the concept of the conservation plan. He was a master's student at York in its very first year of the conservation programme. And we're very proud to acknowledge the tribute that he paid to York, that when he came there, it gave him the place and the space to think creatively about conservation. So we like to think that the seeds of the conservation plan concept were sown in York. So there is a lot to be proud of in that legacy, and a large part of that is in the truly international character of the taught programme and of the research in which we're involved. When the centre marked its, When the centre marked its 30th anniversary in 2002, one of our alumni did a little survey of students from the programme from 1972 to 2002, and he found that a staggering 59 countries were represented amongst the students at York, with 60% of students coming from outside the UK, from Australia, Greece, India, USA, Canada. And this extraordinary worldwide network of alumni in many ways sustains the international profile of the centre. They come back to us, they teach, they visit, do visiting lectures, and they bring students, younger people as students to us. India, about 6% in the profile of our alumni, and I think it's probably about right, isn't it, Louise? About 6% of our current students still come from India, so we have a very steady stream of interaction with India. But conservation as a practice must be agile, however. It must be dynamic within itself, and the centre is not the same kind of institution now as it was then, and through those 47 years, each centre's director has, I think, responded to the issues of their time, both to local context and to global changes, increasingly to global changes. Conservation is not just a technical practice, as I'm sure you'll agree. Conservation is a cultural practice. We feel that very strongly at York. It both respects and is shaped by the distinctive culture of the place in which it is enacted. Conservation here will be a different cultural practice from conservation in York. We share some commonalities, but there are differences. Conservation reflects the social and political context of society, and the things which it privileges are revealing about what matters to that society. And I say things with intention because conservation is about material spatial presence, that material spatial presence in the landscape, whether it's a city landscape or a rural one. It's about that complex, messy totality of what physically makes up a place and the activities that go on in it, whether it's York or Underbad. Fundamentally, however, beyond that materiality, conservation is about the values that lie at the heart of what a society or a community chooses to keep of its heritage and how it chooses to do that. And this is a really central concept in our work at York. The principles of conservation, written by the Centre's first director, Derek Lindstrom, in the 1980s, established the idea of values being at the heart of what we conserve, whether it's something that's 30 years old or 300. And that those values may be symbolic, religious, communal, ephemeral, and will be as much to do with the context of the heritage and its contribution to the quality of environment and quality of life, as perhaps to do with its economic and social value. And it is the understanding of all of those values, that really complex mix, an informed and well-researched, rigorous basis of historical research, analysis of evidence, documentation of the place as it exists now, with all that that can tell us about its story, and an understanding of what it also means to the people who know it and use it now. So that is a lot to deliver, isn't it, for conservation? We like to use this definition of conservation from the Borough Charter, the Australian Borough Charter, the work of James Semple Kerr, that conservation is all the processes of looking after a place so as to retain its cultural significance. So, York's own heritage conservation history is somewhat checkered. We can trace it back into the 18th century. In 1799, the City Corporation set up a committee to investigate its right to demolish the city walls. You can tell what's coming. They believed this was a necessary part of modernising the city, 1799, to encourage visitors and commercial development. Sounds very familiar. Widening streets, building bridges, removing the walls and the bars. We call the gates bars in York. And on the far side is Bootham Bar, as it was in the mid-19th century after the Barbican in front of it had actually been demolished. If you were at John's lecture earlier, he would have shown you the Barbican at Warmgate, I think, where there is one surviving. So the City Corporation, in its wisdom, set about applying for an Act of Parliament that it needed to demolish the city walls. And in the interim, a number of local figures and dignitaries, including the Archbishop of York, quite influential, intervened to prevent demolition of several of the bars, for the time being at least, so they had a stay of execution. And it was a local group, the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, that founded in 1822, which famously formed the York Footpath Association, which had a wall restoration committee. This is how these things snowball. And that campaigned to raise funds to save and repair the city walls, the bars, and their barbicans. And we were very struck to hear how in Ahmedabad, it was at almost exactly the same time that citizens of Ahmedabad were setting up a fund to repair their own city walls. So the city walls are things that citizens value, even if our corporations may not always agree with the way that we want to do it. Sections of the wall did disappear, however, together with the barbicans at many of the bars. But they have left us with some magnificent neoclassical early Victorian buildings instead, which went up in place of the section of wall to the right, as it were, of the city gate. That was the modernist style, that classicism of the day, and from our perspective now, we might perhaps consider that the risk of losing that small stretch of city wall was well balanced and mitigated by the gain of some very gracious early Victorian architecture. And, we need to think about that, whether we do need good modern architecture in our historic places, and we need to make a place for that to happen. So like all cities that are historic, there are periods of change when the value of keeping architectural heritage or archaeological monuments is questioned and challenged more or less successfully. York's history is littered with campaigns to save buildings and overturning schemes for redevelopment, which, had they been enacted, would have left our city a much poorer place. Here is one such that never happened, fortunately. This is I think, 1948 plan to redesigned the walled city, turning it into a kind of huge traffic roundabout with a ring road with little roundabouts all around it, and clearing away to create that green space all of the 17th, 18th, 19th century suburbs that lay outside of the walls. Fortunately, that town plan never happened, but change is inevitable. And to remain a living, working place, buildings have to be repaired, extended, adapted, and added to in an idiom of our own times. The picture on the far side is some of our conservation students up on the scaffold at York Minster. York's Minster is, for those of you who know it, I'm sure you'll agree, a glorious celebration of medieval architecture, and the product of a very continuous process of conservation and repair work which has gone on since the 11th century. Constant rebuilding, extension, embellishment. So at the start of our MA programme, we like our students to visit the Minster's stone yard and to meet its master mason, and the workshops where a long continuous tradition of working stone links craftsmen and women today with the craftspeople who constructed this magnificent building. So here, as in Undergrad, we have a long history of protecting heritage, but also a tradition of continuous renewal and enhancement of the Minster with new sculpture and new designs. And the opportunity to get up on the scaffold, to talk and work alongside the craftspeople who are part of this centuries of tradition and contributing their own reimagining of some of the sculpture on the higher parts of the, I think in this case it was one of the aisle roofs we were up on. I mean, no one will ever get that close. Once that scaffold comes down, no one without a drone and a camera will see that again. But the care and the love that's gone into that carving is palpable and is also fun. It's quite, inventive. So these craftsmen who are a part of centuries of tradition renewing this extraordinary building, meeting them is a unique experience for our students, and to share that an understanding of that skill, invention and creativity that skilled craftsmen and women bring to a conservation project. So how does our research and teaching interact with the City of York, the UK and the wider world? What kinds of opportunities have we taken, and how might they be relevant for the new centre here? Key to many of the projects that we've worked on are two elements that I just want to pick out in my talk: partnership and sustainability. And indeed, in many ways, those two concepts are interchangeable. It's in the nature of good partnership working that it is sustainable. It is only together with other stakeholders and participants that we will find and agree sustainable solutions. That is, ones that benefit people today, whilst also providing longer-term benefits for those who come after us. So partnership and interdisciplinarity are at the heart of conservation studies in York, our research cluster, as indeed I can see that they are here. And we bring together a range of specialisms in the department. We are unique in the UK in being in a department of archaeology rather than a school of architecture or planning. And we feel that this complements well the expertise of CEPT, faculty in architecture, in urban design and geomatics and in heritage. So our internal collaborators in the centre are specialists in building archaeology, survey and interpretation, in historic interiors, experimental archaeology, digital heritage and visualization, historic interiors, a wide range of period specialisms in archaeology, public interpretation. So we have 17 different master's programs at York, which all share a common modular structure so that students can select and tailor their conservation studies program from a really wide range of choices, from understanding 18th century interiors through to digital heritage or 3D modelling. And so finally, I do just want to mention another big part of the family in the department at York, which is the Archaeology Data Service. Digital preservation of heritage data is one of our real strengths in York. We host the National Archaeology Data Service, which also provides data services for architectural heritage, and works with stakeholders to curate and archive digital data sets and help to develop data management and access. So, I just want to look at what I hope will be two relevant themes in the remainder of this lecture to give you some flavour of some of the work that we do and areas where we hope we will be able to collaborate in the future with colleagues. And they are firstly, practice-based teaching and research, and then I'm going to come on to some of our external partnerships. So, at York, practice-based teaching in the Conservation MA has always been a really important part of the curriculum, as well as the history and theory. The programme design includes short skills modules that just run for 4 weeks, as well as term-long core modules of taught classes. Students get the opportunity to try hands-on with craft practitioners guiding them, obviously, using carpentry tools to dress and cut timber, mixing and applying mud mortars, earth mortars and renders, hot mixing lime. We experimented a few years ago with adopting a building, a fascinating 16th century cruck-framed building, on a farm in a village about 10 miles outside York. And the idea was, here we are in I think 2014 or 15, the idea was that year on year students would be able to work on this building to make it first of all weather-tight and watertight, and eventually to repair it to be used as a storage building for the farmer who owned it. And you have to try these things, and I still think it's a really great model, but we found this didn't work well for us year on year because the progress was too slow. Students go off and do their research. The site was too far from the university. We couldn't get there easily to work at weekends. So to do this kind of experimental building conservation project in the city in New York is not really practical for us. It could well work for you here. Our problem in York is that property is so valuable and in such high demand. There are, vacant buildings where you could do this kind of practice-based learning, just not available to us. So currently we use our own campus in the woodland at the rear of the King's Manor for practice-based work. But now, excitingly, we also have another new centre, the New York Experimental Archaeology Research Centre, the YER Centre, which is up on our main campus at Heslington, where our archaeological science colleagues are based in their own bioarchaeology unit. So we plan in future to do more work there, which will enable that kind of practice-based research and the heritage science related to it that we would like to advance. So for the last 10 years or so, we've worked with a number of traditional craftspeople in practice-based research. Nigel Copsey, one of our research associates, is a stonemason, and he's been active in promoting the reintroduction of hot mix limes using quicklime for mortars in historic construction repair. Now, you probably think this is a bit bizarre, but hot mixes, that method of mixing mortars, had virtually passed out of use in practice memory in mainstream conservation work in the UK by the early 2000s, and with lime putty being used sometimes where limes were required, but very largely replaced by the use of natural hydraulic lime as a powder. Recent research is showing that the strengths actually developed by NHLs used in traditional construction are entirely inappropriate. They are far too strong and responsible for accelerating decay and deterioration of brick, masonry, and timber. So unwittingly, thinking that using lime was good practice, the conservation industry has embraced a product which is in fact doing a lot of damage now. So Nigel's work in practice has shown how breathable, slow-setting, more adhesive traditional hot mix lime mortars used as intended in historic buildings produce a much more serviceable and sustainable result. And his research into earth mortars has been equally innovative in showing how widely and effectively such mortars are used, and the case for reintroducing these too. So I was absolutely fascinated this morning to hear how here in Ahmedabad on the city walls you have exactly the same experience, that earth mortars and earth cores are the norm, with line pointing simply being used for the external joints where it's used at all. Nigel's research is commissioned by Historic England and Historic Environment. The research that he's doing with us has been to bring together a survey of historical and archive sources for the traditional use of lime mortars to aid us in essentially reinventing the way that traditional mortars were made and used. So he's been doing a lot of work bringing together the documentary evidence from 17th, 18th, 19th century building accounts that document changes in practice through to the 20th century. Alongside this empirical and historical research, we're also beginning to work with bioscientists in our bioarchaeology centre to look, for example, at the analysis of proteins in historic mortars. That was a dissertation by a recent MA student. Historically, as I'm sure is the case here too, it was common to add a range of organic materials to mortar mixes, such as cow's milk, blood, animal dung, straw, waste products from processing agricultural materials. And often these additives are in the specifications and in the builder's companions, as they were called, are very specific proportions. Now today, the use of such additives in modern mortars in the UK is simply not common practice. We wouldn't know how to specify it, and we wouldn't know what it would do if we did. So we understand very little about the properties of these additives and whether modern chemical plasticizers, set inhibitors, pozzolanic additives are providing the same qualities. So again, I was really fascinated this morning to hear about the 111 mixes that are being used on the city walls here, which is a traditional mix, as I understand it. But of course, you know, these traditional mixes, they vary hugely from place to place. So we're very interested in the idea of pursuing a program of sampling and analysis which would give us a much better handle on the way that traditional mortars are produced. New conservation materials being used for insulation as an alternative to concrete, like hempcrete, have a low carbon footprint, and they can replace materials that have a damaging environmental impact. So understanding how organic additives can be used is a step on the way to more sustainable practice. And that really is a key field for future development, in which my colleague Louise is particularly interested on working on how we can identify traditional renewable resources for more sustainable building practices. And then my second and final theme really is about partnership in research and development. I spoke this afternoon about the important role of collaborative doctoral research as an important new application of research in the UK, towards which all our research funding councils have been moving over recent years. And we have a number of these collaborative research initiatives which have been on advancing policy for conservation, reviewing current thinking, and on local and national approaches to managing heritage assets. We're working with a number of, well, all of these institutions in one or more doctoral programs, which runs over 3 or 4 years. So an example here is with the Within the Walls project, which was with York City Council. And it looked at the shift that we've seen in the UK towards community ownership of heritage assets. Our government's been encouraging this movement positively through legislation since 2012, though in reality many communities have been excellent custodians of heritage places for many years. But this collaborative research is looking specifically at different models for community ownership or management of heritage assets around the city of York, with the researcher actually embedded with local groups examining the opportunities and the challenge that they face. Another collaboration on policy, this time at a national level with Historic England's listing branch, is called Beyond the List, a critical examination of the development and impact of statutory and non-statutory heritage lists, which I think came up in discussion this afternoon. And the researcher here is investigating ways in which local heritage designation policies and national listing policy interact and are developing. This is a longitudinal study over 3 years in which we're seeing the impact of new policies in practice during a period of austerity and steadily reducing local government resources. So this is an area of policy research which is taking us into social sciences methods, qualitative research, interviews, work focus groups with stakeholders, citizens, juries, those kinds of areas where we rely heavily on our collaboration with our own social sciences department. And we have a number of these collaborative policy projects. There's another one looking at the sustainability and resilience of community heritage projects, one with the National Trust and York Archaeological Trust, examining hidden disabilities and the museum visitor. And these areas of research are stretching because they're not just about research development, but they're policy development, but they're taking us, as I say, into areas of social sciences methods using ethnography and examining attitudinal change and participant behaviours where we are learning new skills and having to apply new methodologies. Another interesting new area of partnership has been in conservation in action projects, working this time with two national bodies, the Churches Conservation Trust and English Heritage. These are projects to develop public engagement with the conservation of heritage properties that are open to the public. So they have involved running public workshops as part of the building conservation project, opening up the site to the public during the work, getting the public up on the scaffold, asking people to take the opportunity to talk to craftspeople who are working there and the specialists doing conservation work. And then our role has really partly been to facilitate those engagements, but then to go on to conduct impact assessment to evaluate the effect of those activities. How does it make conservation more meaningful for the public? How does it change views? Does it, in fact? In the long term, what we hope is that we will engender a better understanding and support for what we do, and also inform people about good practice for looking after their own properties. And ultimately, the end game must be for local people to become the gatekeepers for their own heritage, being critically aware of what's being done to it in the name of public conservation. Universities are moving into other areas of international partnerships with public authorities where technical resources, capacity building, public engagement come together. Just a couple of examples. Here at Cockspur Island in Savannah, in the middle of the estuary of the river, I had to canoe out there. It was quite an experience. We managed a training program for the US National Park Authority, run jointly with the University of Urbana-Champaign in Illinois. This was to repair the island's historic lighthouse and develop capacity in their own national park workforce for undertaking the day-to-day conservation maintenance of this very exposed site. And this project was run in conjunction with a studio for Illinois architecture students to design new cabins for the national park. And then finally, a more recent and ongoing collaboration, one that's just started at Elizabeth Castle for Jersey heritage. Last year, this project started with investigations into the later history of the castle's outer bailey. Some excavations focused on recording and analysing a site of an 18th century Barrett block, and the project aims are to inform Jersey Heritage's future management of this presently underutilised part of Elizabeth Castle. And it was also an opportunity for some student training and open days for the public. It delivered documentary research, geophysical survey, measured drawings, some structure for motion photogrammetry of the kind that we did in our workshop to produce 3D visualizations, which could then be used for public interpretation. And we have many other international and conservation and interpretation projects with my colleague Sarah Perry working in Egypt and in Turkey, and my colleague Stephanie Wynne-Jones working in Tanzania, where we're running similar projects. So drawing to a conclusion, centres like the one launched here today and that in York have several important roles in their cities. York and Ahmedabad are both global heritage cities. Ahmedabad already India's first World Heritage City, and York aspiring to be nominated as one, and already an internationally recognised heritage destination. Our centres have global outlooks on heritage conservation, but they're also firmly rooted in local working partnerships with heritage stakeholders. The scope of our work can range from policy development at national level to international consultancy, but what keeps us grounded, I think, and moves forward our thinking is those local pilot studies, those small-scale projects to support third sector and civic groups, which help us to be innovative and experiment and to be responsive to local people, which is where conservation is certainly moving. Fundamental to this range of scales and initiatives are strong partnerships and trusted collaboration, really, and ultimately co-production with local people, bringing our respective expertises to bear on common issues and shared experience. The partnership in the York team here, the university, the city, and Historic England is one that works well for us. Already in these several days spent together with colleagues here, we can see so many exciting potential areas where we can work together in the future, and we're looking forward so much to spending time tomorrow exploring this further in our second day of seminar, and in years to come, working with your new Centre for Conservation Studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. I think that puts, I think I'm already nervous. It puts a very big onus on our center that we are starting off and gives us a lot of hope and direction to where we really can, where we can aim to take our center to. If there's anything that anybody wants to discuss here or has questions about, we can open the forum for that discussion. I'll bring the mics to you if anyone wants to ask anything. Or we can continue the discussion. There's going to be tea outside, tea and biscuits, so we can all move there in 2 minutes and have informal discussions. I would conclude by thanking all the members of University of York, and thanking Jill, specifically Louise and Alessandra for being here. I thank Keith from Historic England, John Oxley from the City Council of York. I think we have members of Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, Mr. Nair, and Ashish from AWHCT. I'm possibly never going to get right, but I hope I've got it. And I think I'll end by, or before I end, I'll thank all my teachers who are here and my colleagues who are here to support me and support the center and our journey, all the members of the center who are here in our journey. And lastly, I'll thank Nigar, are you here? Yeah. Sarvesh, Surud, and Gaurav for organizing all of this and being on your toes, and all the student volunteers as well. I believe we had organized a gift for all our participants of the workshop, a very interesting publication by CEPT Press, but it's not ready. We'll possibly courier it to you. So thank you everybody for being here, and please join us for tea upstairs. Yeah. Thank you.